data visualization, splitting, and avoiding data poisoning. It's kind of a dramatic way to say it, but basically like avoiding basically getting overconfident about your results, I suppose. So at a very high level, I'm sure many of you know this, but computer vision is essentially trying to predict something about what is in an image, understand or tell us something about what is in an image. And here for this class, maybe image is a bit of a vague term. We might be talking about spectrograms or some sort of like sonogram. But essentially, we're trying to interpret what is in an image. And these days, usually what we're trying to do is actually generate a model that will estimate the probability of a given category, Y, or class here, Y, given, conditioned on that image that we showed the model, X. And so maybe this model would spit out something like, my estimated probability of Y given X is 95% for elephant and 5% for giraffe. Now, the important thing to note here is it's an estimated probability, and actually there's not usually in these methods something that's trying to enforce it to be a proper probability. So I'm sure you've heard this a lot before, but these output scores that come out of these models shouldn't really be treated as probabilities. And I often try to call them scores to remind myself that they're not probabilistic, they're not rooted in probability. But so usually these days, this is some sort of supervised model. We're basically using some supervision, some set of data to learn to estimate this probability of Y given X for any image from some subset of data, some subset of images with the correct label. And that subset of data might have a few ideal qualities. So one thing, this is just, when we're talking about these prototyping data sets you guys are bringing in, ideally it should be representative and sort of a representative sampling of your entire data set. We'll spend probably the rest of this lecture talking about why that's kind of impossible, but we want to do our best to have it be representative of what we want to use this model to do. Now, the rest of these qualities are things that are actually just going to make your life a lot easier. It's important that these are standardized, sanitized, structured, and serverable is a bit of a weird thing here, but essentially like easy to move around. So this is really more on a lot of the work you hopefully have done coming in, where you're standardizing your data, you're cleaning it, you're making sure everything is sort of in the same structure, has the same metadata, basically as is easy to work with as possible, and that you know what all those things are. We want it to be easy and relatively quick to move it around, copy it, back it up, basically work with it on different machines, on different computers, locally if possible. So you want it to therefore not be too huge. When you're doing this initial prototyping of what model you want to use, you want it to be small enough and kind of structured in a way that makes it easy to move around. You want it to be inspectable with minimal tooling or with some default programs. So this is essentially like you want to be able to poke at it, visualize your labels, look at the images, make sure they're not corrupted. And ideally, you want to do that in a way that doesn't mean you have to write your entirely own code and functions for that. So one of the reasons Suzanne had sort of set us all on the path of like, maybe you want to build a version of the metadata in something like Cocoa, is there exist a lot of tools on the internet for Cocoa structured metadata that let you load in an image, visualize bounding boxes on it with class labels, like tools for inspecting your data. And inspecting data is very important. You really end up needing to, during training, like make sure things look reasonable, but also very importantly during test time, you need to be able to easily inspect and poke at and look at the results of the model on your data. And then you want it to theoretically be also able to be manually explored, your accuracy, using sort of random selection and again, visualization. So you want it to be easy for yourself to be convinced of the accuracy of your labels, or if you start seeing something weird, you want it to be pretty easy for you to just be able to say, okay, I want to pull up a random set of the images with labels and like check that the labels seem correct. I can't tell you the number of times that my models don't seem to be learning anything, or they're learning something really weird. And I discover it's because somewhere in the code, there's something that's assuming that my set of categories starts at 0 or starts at 1. And that assumption maybe isn't well structured or easy to see, like in the code base, but it's there. And so then they're doing some sort of weird automated mapping between either 0 indicated or 1 indicated sets of class labels. This is dumb, but it happens. You want to make sure that somehow your categories aren't getting mapped to something weird, or you're losing something, or something's going on. And so this being able to like probe the accuracy of your raw data set can convince you that actually maybe the issue is now in the data loader, like something happening when you're actually loading the data into the model where the correct labels aren't being mapped to the correct images or something like that. Essentially, a machine learning model is only as good as the data is given. And a lot of these things, these qualities, are really more for you. How do you make your life easier? Than they are necessarily related, except for that first one around representative sampling, to the actual training of the model. So I'm going to talk through a little bit of like, the simplest possible case, kind of what these models are learning and why the sense of representative sampling becomes so important. So the simplest possible classifier is just learning to categorize points on a plane. So here we have a set of points in M, N space, like some value of M, some value of N, and we want to learn a model that will color them as either orange or blue. So if I put a new point on this plane, I want the model to tell me, should it be orange or should it be blue? We assume at first we have this representative data, aka IID. So how many of you guys are familiar with the concept of independently and identically distributed? Okay, so this is like it's like a statistical concept, but essentially the idea is that the data that you're drawing from, like the distribution of data you're drawing from, is independently. So that means each point independently is like kind of drawn from that same distribution, and identically. So they're all drawn from the same distribution. Some of them aren't drawn from a different distribution than others distributed. This is a fundamental assumption of a lot of the theory that builds out things like stochastic gradient descent, getting you to maybe close to the optimal solution for a model, is that the training data would be independently and identically distributed to your test data. And then you can make, in the simple models at least, some guarantees that you are, in fact, actually getting to the best possible model given the sort of set of methods that we use to get to that model. So using our labeled data, say we learn this linear classifier. You learn essentially this line, you say it on this side of the line it's orange, that side it's blue. So how do we know if that model works? How do we know if it's good? In practice, we could get more data, grab some new points, throw them on the plane, and actually then test our model on that data, look at the results of the points and say, is it getting it correct? Or what is more likely is we're going to pretend at training time that we don't have some of the data. We're going to pretend that some of it hasn't been seen yet and then test the model on that data. This is the idea of a test set. So since the data is assumed to be IID, we randomly are sampling a subset to use as evaluation data. Now you would take just these training data, which I've colored sort of lighter, and you would learn maybe the same model. And then you say, okay, let's take the test data. We're going to check if the predictions are correct. And it looks like they are. So great. Our model works great. But it's also important to note that there are many possible solutions to this small problem. And so not all of those solutions, which would have perfectly solved the training data, we would have gotten all of the colors correct for the training data, would actually work well on that validation data. And so this idea of choosing which model out of the many that are technically doing very well on our training data is the one we actually want to deploy, that's called model selection. Essentially, you're saying we're going to take this subset of data, the test data we've generated, and we're going to say the one that works best on the test data is the one that we are going to use. But then that means that your validation data isn't truly unseen, right? Because you're actually choosing the model based on performance on that data. So in order to try to can keep the integrity of the concept of true test, we then further subsample the data to include a test set, which theoretically, you should never look at test performance until you've selected a model and now you're going to deploy it and use it. Most machine learning practitioners don't do this. They're constantly looking at test performance, and they're actually often doing model selection based on test performance. Honestly, for simplicity, many of us might only pick a validation data set, operate on that, and then maybe actually in deployment, now you're going to hold out a whole separate year or something and try to evaluate next year, see how it goes. Also, if you just don't have that much data, it can be very hard to subsample into 3 separate categories. So this is definitely best practice if you have the capacity and the data to do it. But many machine learning practitioners are very bad at properly holding out their test data. And it's actually quite hard to do. You're like, okay, I have this whole set of data. I'm doing all this prototyping. I'm not ever going to look at performance on that until maybe, I don't know, right before I publish my paper or something. Then it's like you find out, oh, wait, it's doing something really weird on that. Now you're going to go back to the drawing board and you're going to do something different. So just like from a human psychology perspective, it's like really hard for us to really leave some of the data alone. So what ends up really in practice happening is people really only test things when they're deployed. But this is part of the problem, because a lot of things, times when things are deployed, they don't work the same. So this combination of a data set, so the initial set of all the points we have in hand, the things we have in our hand, a task, for us this is orange versus blue, and how to evaluate that task. So, did you get it correct? And this split of the data, this part is trained, this part is validation, this part is test. That's what we call a benchmark. So if you hear people talking about a benchmark in machine learning, that's what they mean. It's this combination. It's not just data. It's data plus a task, plus an evaluation metric, plus a split of the data that you're going to use to evaluate how good your model is on doing that task on that data set. And benchmarks have played a really integral role in computer vision research. And Pietro and some of Pietro's students have really constructed some pretty formative data sets in this space. But it turns out that designing benchmarks is really hard. This was a workshop that I would totally recommend you all check out if you kind of want to get a little depressed, called The Reproducibility Crisis in Machine Learning-Based Science. They took a hugely diverse set of different fields where people were applying machine learning, everything from medicine to toxicology to satellite imagery. And then they took a subsample of well-cited papers, well-vetted things, and then they explored those papers and looked for pitfalls in the benchmark construction process. And I just would like to highlight that 17 out of 17 papers in satellite imagery had non-independence between their train and test sets. So there was actually overlap, either geospatially or temporally or what have you, between train and test in a way that did not make the results reproducible in deployment. So what if our initial assumption was wrong and the data we started with wasn't fully representative of where we want to use it? What if we now go out and we take more data at higher values of M, and then it would actually turn out that maybe our model would just be completely wrong when now you've moved out of that distribution, the space where the training data lived in the sort of data space. It would classify all those points as blue, but actually quite a few of them are orange. So this is what we talk about when we're talking about going out of distribution. You're moving away from the sort of distribution where the training data was sampled into some different thing in some way. So here it's bigger values of M. And now there may not be any guarantees you can make about the performance of the model now that you've moved out of distribution. So the domain of the original data was within the red circle. This out of domain data is now not properly classified. So ideally, you'd want to learn a general classifier, a classifier that would work on all possible data. But it turns out this is a huge open problem for machine learning, because if you only have some of the sort of data space available to you, it's really difficult to just guess what the proper categories might be out of distribution. In ecology, this is also a really common thing. It's referred to as extrapolation. So I'm sure you guys have talked about the extrapolation of like an occurrence model or a species distribution model. It's well known that actually that usually is pretty bad. Things don't tend to extrapolate very well. And it's the exact same problem. These things are built on the same underlying statistical methods, and If you move too far out of distribution, your predictive capacity probably will degrade. It turns out, unfortunately for us, that these types of domain shifts or distribution shifts are really, really common anytime you move into the real world. The real world is just not IID. The world's actually changing all the time. And even if you could capture like a perfect snapshot in time of the world today, every facet of every category you're interested in, their distribution, all the different visual variation, that's going to change. And it's actually that change for ecology is accelerating because of climate change. So if you had that perfect representative data set today, next year or even next week, there are changes that are affected in this really complex systems, right? Weather, all sorts of stuff. So the idea that we can actually build a representative IID data set of the real world is maybe just an assumption that's a little bit faulty to begin with. But one thing that we can try to do is start to explore what is a reasonable claim based on our data by explicitly building evaluation frameworks or benchmarks that try to measure that out of distribution performance. Or now here, that out of distribution performance is somehow representative of the ways that we think the model might be used out of distribution. So that could be a temporal generalization on a set of camera traps. If the way you want to use the actual model is on those same camera traps, but next year, you can just hold out an entire season in time, evaluate on that. Now, this is not a guarantee of what performance will be ever, but it will give you a rough sense of how much or what are the ways you might expect performance to degrade over time, as opposed to possibly giving you a pretty false sense of, I guess, like comfort or security that your model is performing at 99% accuracy, but in a space where it's kind of memorized a lot of the maybe correlations or context and does a really good job predicting in distribution, but struggles out of distribution.
Sarah,
yeah.
May I inject an anecdote at this point? I don't mean to disrupt. So
no, please.
Flow. Okay, so 15 years ago, we collected the first bird data set by downloading birds from the internet and classify them by species. And initially, our classifiers were doing very well. We're following the typical recipe that Sara alluded to, namely you have a large data set and you randomly select 80% of it as your training set, and then 10% of it as your validation set, 10% of it as your test set. So we train and test 90% correct, fantastic, amazing. So you have to think that at the time, deep networks are not there already. So we were not used to good performance, we were used to horrible performance. At some point, we realized the problem. And the problem was that unlike the typical data sets that people in computer vision deal with, which come from having sampled the internet, and there are photographs that people take at parties, on vacation, this and that. And so there are millions of photographs taken by millions of different people in millions of different locations, times of the day, and so on. The data that come from birders are highly correlated. And the typical correlation is, I can frame this beautiful blue jay, and now I take 7 shots because it's turning around a little bit, and I push into the database all of them. So what happens when I select at random from my data set? Well, out of those 7 shots, 4 will end up in the training set, 2 in the validation set, and 2 in the test set. And so the test set has almost perfect copies of what was there in the training set. And so I'm just recognizing the fact that the photos are identical. And so that was a point where we realized that the way the computer vision and machine learning communities had formalized the problem was incorrect as soon as you move into a real life domain like ecology, because of this correlation in the individual pieces of data. So the fix was simple once we understood what the problem was, and it was to set a date, and it was the 1st of January at the time, maybe 2015 or whatever. And so any image coming before was training, and the image coming after was testing. At that point, all of these quasi-identical images were either in the training set or in the test set, but not in both. And so now we get to what Sara is telling us, which is the second issue, which is now we have images taken last year for training, and we test on images taken next year. What could have changed? Well, you know, the weather may be different, maybe the quality of the cameras that people use are different, and all of a sudden there is a new camera that everybody's crazy about, and so the quality of the image is a little bit different. New people show up and they take photos in new places. So you may have tons of pictures in a tiny village of Wales, where in the training set, nobody had gone to that village in Wales with that kind of light and background and so on. And so there are these two issues. One is these quasi-duplicates in ecology pictures, and we have to keep them either all in the training set or in test. And the second one is what Sara is talking now, which is domain shift, namely the statistics of the world are walking around a bit, and we have to be aware of it. And it may have to do with time or place, as Sara will tell us, etc. So
Yeah,
Sara,
exactly.
I thought I would.
No, and that's a great anecdote, but it really gets at, again, another dimension of this, which is you can be very well intentioned and think you've thought through all of the possible dimensions and think you've constructed this data set as well as you can, and then find out that actually maybe there's an issue. And one of the ways that I often find out that there's an issue with my data split is when my model is suspiciously good. So if your model looks really good, you want to be very, very, very careful now about going in and poking everything you can think of about how it might be cheating, basically. Yeah, and this type of distribution shift, domain shift, but also the degradation in performance of the model when you go out of domain tends to be actually ubiquitous, really consistent across applications in the real world. So you guys are not alone in this being a challenge when you're actually trying to use these models in reality. And it turns out that it's not even as simple as just like, oh, well, part of the problem is that when you go out of distribution, for really rare classes, maybe you've only seen them in certain contexts or in certain lighting or certain poses, and so we're seeing all this degradation is happening for the rare stuff. But it actually turns out that out of distribution generalization, that performance degradation tends to happen even for common species. This is a figure from a paper I wrote a while ago where we just were holding out some of the camera locations for species prediction using camera trap data, and we found this pretty consistent drop off in performance. Though clearly, rare stuff's still hard, right? Like performance is way worse for things that have, 10 images or less. But even as you're going up to 1,000 or 10,000 examples per category, that gap still remains. But maybe, 90% for those common species, that's probably good enough to be useful, right? You don't need these things to be perfect. The kind of question is like, really, what's good enough to be useful out of domain? And like I was talking about before, unfortunately, it's not even just the case that the world is changing. It's also that we have a pretty huge bias in where and when we have data. So this is like a heat map of global biodiversity. It's an estimate of alpha diversity, and a map of data in GBIF. And you can see that where we have data is pretty systematically biased. So you can imagine that if we're going to any of those dark spots in the map and trying to use a species classification model or a species distribution model, that is going to be pretty untrustworthy. So why is it so hard? Like, why do things not generalize the way we want them to? So I mentioned this a bit yesterday, but one dimension of it is this subpopulation shift. So you have essentially different species likelihoods within the same set of possible species. So say the Caltech camera traps data set is an early one that we released. That's all camera traps around the greater LA area. There's a couple sort of beyond that in southwest US. We have like a camera trap there that's really close to a bobcat den. And like 90% of the images of that specific camera are bobcats. That's way out of distribution, just in terms of subpopulation distribution. As a result, like a bunch of them get predicted to be domestic cat because that's way more common in aggregate. And so the models learned when it's not super certain that it's more likely to be rewarded during training if it predicts domestic cat than bobcat, because bobcat's more rare. You also might have different sets of possible species. You take a model trained on Caltech camera traps and try to use it in Washington, there are going to be species in Washington that we've never seen before. And this is another and maybe even more challenging version of this subpopulation shift. And we call this the open set problem. When the set of categories you're interested in, you might not have all of them during training. There may be some things that you're interested in that show up that you've never seen during training. And so, if you actually take your class distribution, if you have static sensors, camera traps, bioacoustic sensors, hydrophones under the water, and you look at the distribution of classes across those locations, I'm sure all of you have seen that those distributions are not identical across the different sets. And so this is all representative of this sort of subpopulation distribution shift problem. And that is one dimension of what makes this hard. And it actually turns out that machine learning performance has a strong correlation with distribution similarity. So this is a figure from a recent paper where we were looking at tree species identification. And so this is just a rough sense of how similar are the distribution of trees across these different cities. So you're comparing sort of Vancouver to Vancouver or to Seattle. The trick here is like the reason it's not completely dark down that diagonal is that within each city we had a spatial split. So as one part of the city is for training, one part is for tests to avoid that memorization problem. So sometimes cities have pretty wild distribution shifts even just within their city. So the training and test are not completely aligned. But so this is just roughly getting at essentially a normalized distribution across the categories of interest in that city. And you can see that, I don't know, there's clear differences between like Southern California and the Northwest. Now, if you take that, and now you look at, now this is kind of, the colors are flipped here, but now this is looking at accuracy. If you train on one city and test on another city, how well does that model generalize? What are the things that it does well? You can start to see that there are clear patterns here, right? You tend to get better generalization when your distributions are more similar. And it kind of makes sense because essentially the distribution over your training classes, it's kind of, you can almost think of it as a prior, a likelihood prior that the model is learning. If all other things will equal, essentially you're just saying like say you gave the model no images at all, like just black, and then you gave it the category set distributed like your category set. It would by definition learn to predict the most common thing, because that's the optimal solution if it has no other information. And so that signal is still there even when you have the images, and it will actually affect what your model is likely to predict. So the other dimension of why this is hard is visual shift. Different camera angles, different sensor types, different resolutions in satellite imagery, different backgrounds, different individuals, different ages, night versus day, summer versus winter, wet versus dry. You name it. It's really, really hard to identify wet snow leopards, it turns out. Just, if anyone's curious. And then this is where it also, with something like a static sensor, gets really messy. Because no wonder if you do random selection, or even if you do temporal splits, you get really good performance, because these images were taken a month apart, right? But actual animal behavior tends to be consistent, particularly with relation to a given scene for a given species. So these might even be the exact same deer, who knows, or they could be different deer, but these are nearly identical images, right? But they were taken a month apart. So you have high visual similarity from a single static sensor. There's a strong correlation spatiotemporally across the data. And there's strong visual differences across different sensors, even for the same categories. This is just over time. Sometimes these things change quite drastically. This is an example I love just because it's cool. It's a wildfire burned through the area, but it turns out the coyote came back 3 days later. And different ecosystems have both subpopulation and visual shift. So this is an example of another machine learning benchmark for ecology. This is was made by Ben Weinstein, who's giving a talk on Thursday. So over 100 million trees. And you can see as you go to the different neon sites, both the distribution of trees, like the density of trees, the distribution of species that are seen in those different locations, and sort of visually what those things look like, all three of those change. So a bit of a think, pair, share activity. Just take, 5 minutes And think about what's your targeted use case for the model you want to develop at the school. How do you want to use it? Not like what's your data set that you have in hand now. If this model seems good, how do you want to use it going forward? And then based on the data that you do have right now, what are some of the issues in terms of generalization that you might encounter? Where are the gaps between the data you have now and the data you hope to use the model on going forward? And just sketch down a few thoughts, and then I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to ask you to pair up and share.
Well, it's my data. What is the targeted use case?
Think for yourself first.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. What was your target? Oh, my targeted use case. My targeted use case is that it's run on any hydrophone deployment. My
I was supposed to do this
first figure it out, and then sorry.
I was just fun.
I thought we were supposed to talk about it.
Think, pair, share. Step one is think, theoretically. All right, so everyone pair up. I think there's maybe gonna be one group of 3, but let's see how it works. And just each of you try to take just a really quick minute to describe what you just thought about. So what's your use case and what are the dimensions of generalization that you think you might encounter when you want to use the model for your targeted use case?
Yeah. Sure.
So my target is everyone, but I know what you my name is Jared. And I only brought data from generalization. Each of them, like kind of where you have, I guess, So in terms of differences, like previous deployment, there will be like similarity. Different deployment, it's like there will be like some specific differences based on the hydroponics, ambient conditions. Oh, right, okay, like always different ones. So in this data set, there's all these like but another data set, but in some data sets, we find yeah. So the problem is that I don't have a very good training data set of all the always conditions that I might account. So I think that will be a change.
If they rank that. Exactly.
I'm not sure.
Well, actually,
Yes, yeah, you can. Yeah, it depends.
so it is like all over.
If you haven't already switched over, you should switch over to the other person.
Or other people like to imagine this is that many, so like the biggest because but I haven't trained much into this species. But I think they potentially like different.
Yeah, I got
It might take a long time. Yeah, but trails are far away. You have angles that you probably going to have to do the types of that. Right, mine too, mine sometimes I know that are really funny, like there's always one right there, but we just manage it. And it's scrappy for the bell. So I'm like, I kind of want to actually not, I was aware that you like yours
Okay, awesome. You can totally talk more about this at the break or at lunch. But just for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. I hope everyone got through at least some of what they wanted to say. Okay, so just thinking a little bit about this is a slide from Jason Parham that I just really loved. Right at the beginning, I was talking about things that will make your life difficult. So this is called headache dataset, and I think you can imagine why this would make your life hard. So just a reminder, if you haven't already, trying to now really invest a little bit of time today and tomorrow in getting everything structured so that it's all the same and it's standardized will make your life so much easier as you go into training and evaluating these models. You run into way less issues. So if your data looks like this and you have a bunch of weird stuff, like most of the cameras are named integers, but those are repeated and it's not unique, and actually one of them is named Fred, and also your sequence IDs are not unique, and the image names are a bunch of different things, and also the images are different image types and different sizes, and you have a bunch of weirdness in your spatial information. Like, just just like a little self-reflection. If your data looks like this, try to figure out what is standardized and clean and what can you use and what do you want to work with. And maybe if you have like some extra subset of data that's a bit messy and you're not really sure if you want to use it yet, maybe start with not using it and stick with the stuff that's sort of well established, well curated. Your ideal data set would be something like this, where things are uniquely identified, standardized, even the structure of the folders and everything's pretty stable. Okay, so rules of thumb, trying to capture some of the stuff we just talked about. All your cameras, days, seasons, biomes, species, individuals would be represented. Like that's probably not possible. And this is actually something that I think becomes quite challenging, is you have to start to make choices. Because if you decide you want this model to generalize to new camera traps in the same place, that means you probably want to have some held out locations. But now if you subsample a set of locations to hold out, it's possible that there are some species that have only been seen in those locations, and now you're forcing yourself into an open set scenario. And that's fine, it's just a choice that you want to make sure you document. And this is why we have that CD documentation template and all of that stuff, is to understand, and so you guys have this record of all of the choices you made, and you can actually note there, like, okay, this is a choice I made. I know it's maybe not ideal for these reasons, but it's kind of like the trade-off. There's always trade-offs, right? So you just have to make choices and document them, and you want to be able to justify them to yourself in the future, essentially. You want to try and keep everything in the same formats and types as much as possible. Actually, specifically for machine learning training, you'll get some weird issues if like your model's trying to load from your data loader, like camera names, and they're all integers and it's expecting integers, and then one of them is a string, it'll crash and the model will stop training. So like machine learning models expect things to be the same type. And so some amount of curation, just trying to make sure everything's like as standard and the same type across like identifiers, that will be worth putting in some time. And the other thing you want to do is you want to make sure it's like pretty easy to remove bad data if you discover that some of your data during training is just bad for some reason, corrupted, mislabeled. Turns out actually there was one camera trap that just got twisted on its side and it's doing something really weird with my training set. You want to be able to actually on the fly iterate on this data set. So you don't want it to be so set in stone that it's not easy for you to like remove a set of images or a set of IDs for later as you go throughout the course. You kind of want to keep everything reasonably small. You want to convert everything into consistent file formats. And then the last one is you really do want to make sure you understand your data. So you want to be able to really be able to check your data by hand, convince yourself your data presents a solvable problem. And also just like, I think the intuition you build about the data really helps you make choices about the parameters of the models that you're training, the data augmentation, all of that. So I think building intuition, really looking at the data helps a lot. Another thing that we want to talk about is sample efficiency. So when you're constructing these prototype data sets, it turns out that stuff like this ends up not only is it like maybe a weird thing if you're training on one and testing on the other, if you're training on one and training on the other, this second image doesn't provide as much value. They're so similar that the model's not actually learning very much from it versus if you had another image of a deer that was a very different pose or at a different location or during the nighttime. And this is something we call like sample efficiency. So like how much value does each data sample provide? And actually maybe can we be thoughtful about training only on sort of diverse data that's as valuable as possible, it gives you as much bang for your buck in terms of like training time, and especially when we're prototyping. And this is just with Caltech camera traps, if we're doing cropped box classification, if we take the training data and we train on 100%, outer distribution test accuracy is 83.4. If you train on 50%, so half the data, out of distribution test accuracy only drops by 1%. If you go down to 25% of the data, this is selected at random from the training set, you only go down, 3%. So as far as like, eventually you might want to train on all of your data. That is giving you these little boosts in accuracy. So for prototyping, it's probably not necessary. And So if you're trying to figure out, like Michael, how to make choices about how to subsample the label data you have to make it a sort of tractable, efficient prototyping data set, sample efficiency is something I would target there. Let's not keep multiple images that look nearly identical. This is like a big meta question. Do you want to balance your training data or not? So if you have highly imbalanced data, there's a few different things you could do. You can balance your training set by subsampling common classes. So basically taking your common data and just not even looking at some of them. You can balance your training set by upsampling the frequency that the model sees rare classes. Now you're keeping all your data, but you're basically at each training step time within your batches, you're just showing the model the rare things more often, which is kind of tricking it into, it gets more loss on those images. Kind of similarly, you can actually just use something like a class balanced loss, where now if you have a really common category, the model doesn't get as much benefit if it gets it correct as if it gets a rare category correct. So you're actually inverse weighting the amount of loss that the model sort of learns from or accrues for those rare species versus common ones. All three of these are reasonable things to do. You're more than welcome to discuss this in depth for your specific problem with your TAs, your mentors, your group. There just are multiple things you can do, and there isn't actually a general, like, this is the right thing to do. It tends to be a bit contextual. You also need to think about how to measure performance on imbalanced data. So you can either balance your test set, explicitly just sample a test set that's uniform, or my personal favorite is to try to maintain what I call realistic test distributions. So try to have your test set be as representative as possible of the distribution of your targeted use case. And then use multiple metrics. Use both balanced metrics and imbalanced metrics and class-specific metrics, and just lots and lots and lots of different metrics instead of a single number to help you understand the performance in a more nuanced way and help you do that model selection process with as much context as possible. So that's what I like to do. But for example, the iNaturalist data set, because they were doing 10,000 classes, they couldn't reasonably keep a representative test set that was efficient, and so they decided to keep 3 examples per category as the test sets. And but then the test set is still 30,000 images. So it kind of just depends on what your use case is. And again, there's always these trade-offs here.
Can you touch on what you mean by balanced and imbalanced metrics a little bit more?
Yeah. So similarly to how you can use a class balance loss, where you sort of penalize the model more if it makes a mistake on a rare thing. You can also look at metrics in ways that are sort of might be balanced across classes. And there's lots of different examples. Maybe the simplest one is overall accuracy is an imbalanced loss if your data is imbalanced. So overall accuracy is just like, how many of the test data did you get correct, regardless of anything? And that's actually pretty representative of like, maybe like the practical use of the model, like how much time would you have to spend to like correct the results that are wrong? You can also, if you really care about rare species, for example, or if you think that your case, most of your data is going to be negative and you're going to have very, very few examples that are positives, like very few examples of rodents, then you might want to look at an overall accuracy model. Might tell you 99% accuracy, but it's actually just always predicted no rodent because there's so few rodents that's not captured in that metric. And so then you could do something like class average accuracy, where you take each set of data represented by a specific category, calculate the accuracy over each of those independently, and then take an average across those accuracies per class. And we're going to get way into metrics in an evaluation metrics lecture next week. But yeah, there are ways to think about, like, and then there's like in between metrics that are things like F1 score that are kind of a balance between precision and recall. So we've actually only got about 5 minutes. So this is something that I think you'll probably just do kind of during work time today. It's kind of just this, did this lecture make you think any differently about how you're going to split up your prototype data set? If not, like, and you thought about all this already, I think one thing that I like to do is try to think about given the data you have, what are the reasonable claims that you can make about performance? So if you have a model and that model is 60% accurate on your test data, what claims can you make about where that model might be able to be used or not? If it's 90% accurate on your test data, what claims can you make about your targeted use case? And I think this is like a personal vendetta of mine, but I would really like to stop seeing ecology papers where people say something like, I will never, now we've fully automated the process of identifying, species of butterflies globally, and we're so excited about it. And you look at the data and it's like they trained on 2 species in one like butterfly park. And I'm like, there's just a huge disconnect between like what it means to have a performance metric on a subset of data and what claims you can make. So I want you all to make reasonable claims. All right, and again, just a quick plug, but like rigorous experimental practices and understanding what does and does not generalize does in fact enable impact. So one of the things with that Caltech camera traps paper that we found while explicitly studying generalization, that while the classification stuff was still hard, still didn't generalize, we found that detection, class agnostic detection, generalized really well. And then we were able to I went to Microsoft, I was like, this I think is ready for deployment. It's generalizing really well. It's doing a good job of solving part of the problem for many people. It's not solving anyone's problem end to end, but it can save people a lot of time. So we built this mega detector model, and now it gets used by a ton of people, like in, probably 80 different countries. We processed 100 million images last year. And I think it's one of the most widely used machine learning models just practically in ecology. And a huge part of that, making that possible, was understanding what claims we could make. We're like, actually, without retraining, you probably can use this to identify animals in your data set, but it won't identify them to species. Anyway, we'll talk about that more. I think, so this is again talking about claims. I think I'm going to move on so that I can make sure to call into the Zoom and let Dan Morris in. But while I'm working, or actually maybe, do you think you could come or someone could come up and set up Dan and I'll answer any questions? Okay. Cool.
So I'm stopping the recording.
Yeah, stopping this one and we'll start a new one.